I'm Anne McElvoy from Politico.
And I'm Sam Coates of Sky News. Welcome to our summer specials, where we take a deep dive into one subject for half an hour or so to arm you with everything you need to know about what's coming up this autumn, with the help of a special guest.
Joining us today is a long-standing friend of this podcast, Sky News' Ed Conway.
Hello, can I just say it is an honour to be actually in the recording. Normally, when I take part in this, I kind of send a little voice note to Sam and then he caustically introduces it at some point in the podcast. Whereas now I have some more control over the way I'm going to be represented. So thank you.
Previously, someone who was seen but not really heard and not really engaged with, but now you get to fight back. Good luck. Now, Ed is one of those journalists who has studied Rachel Reeves pretty much more closely than anybody else. And we'll talk about Rachel the person in a little bit. But when we left for recess, I think this government was facing an incredibly serious situation. I'd go as far as to call it a crisis. Rachel Reeves can't cut spending because she's done a spending review, and she can't cut welfare because she can't get it through Parliament. So tax rises on a massive scale appear to be on their way. And that feels like a mega political problem.
Yeah, it's a massive problem. Obviously, it was treading into very uncomfortable territory for Labour to deal with benefits and to cut benefits in particular from people who might be the most vulnerable. And so it was always going to be difficult. But if ever there were a time where it should be possible, it's in your first year when you have this enormous stonking majority and you're kind of kitchen sinking all of the tough stuff. So if they can't do it then I think a lot of people in the market would be looking at this. Everyone knows we've got big problems with the economy. You've got kind of worklessness. You've got a lack of growth. You've got people kind of not listing their companies in London, the whole shebang, as well as a tax system that's pretty dysfunctional to start off with. If on top of that, you've got a question mark over whether the government, even with this massive majority, can't actually do something about it, that's big. And then you've just got the kind of fiscal arithmetic, which is really challenging. So, all that stuff they weren't able to pass, that kind of reduces the amount of headroom that Rachel Reeves has against her fiscal rules by about not quite 10 billion, but getting on for it. And then on top of that, the fact that the economy is basically a bit weaker than the Office for Budget Responsibility thought it was going to be last time it did its forecast. She said that first budget was the difficult one, and now I've done that, I don't have to do it again. She has to do it again, and she has to do it with more potentially unpopular stuff.
So I'm going to hold your feet to the fire a bit here, Ed. If you can hold feet to the fire and a black hole, because we do mixed metaphors on this podcast, especially when there's three of us. Who knows? We could possibly go into the sort of fifth dimension on this one.
There's no fire in black holes.
See, this is the trouble with people who know stuff. Why do we book them? But look, she's going to have to do something. She gave interviews before the recess saying she wasn't going to touch the big four taxes: income tax, national insurance, VAT, and corporation tax. That's 75%, I think, of revenue raises are off the table. Where are you seeing this very, very skinny wriggle room?
So I think tax-free allowances, freezing those allowances, or at least the bands at which you start paying kind of higher rate tax and so on, seems like the easiest, in inverted commas, thing they could do right now. It brings in quite a lot of money in one fell swoop, and it's so distant that people won't feel it today, and therefore it's still kind of, you can almost bank it and it works against your fiscal rules. But it's not enough. That's the problem, isn't it? On top of that, you have to stack other things. I think, straightforward wealth taxes. So the thing that Lord Kinnock was talking about, 2% on people's wealth over a certain amount. The problem is administratively, I don't think HMRC has the data to be able to make that happen. So even if you wanted to do it, you've just got this monumental challenge of actually how do you make it happen, leaving aside the bigger kind of questions about whether you're just going to drive even more people out of the country. And I think that is real. The numbers on how many millionaires are leaving the country, it's quite hard to collect those kind of figures.
Are you really saying that HMRC can't tell us who is rich enough to pay a wealth tax of people who are not going to leave the country?
Supposedly, this is what people who know this stuff better than I are saying, that it's administrative challenges, that the tax system is very good at monitoring kind of income. It's very good at like stamp duties and things like that, kind of bird in the hand stuff. It's just not very good at taxing wealth, just because we don't have that much experience of it historically. And that's before you kind of get to the question of, even if you had the kind of registry for this stuff, then, would you actually raise much money from it? I think, back to your question, the most sensible, but also, frankly, most unpopular thing to do would be to sort out council tax. Those bans have been unchanged since the 1990s. It is crazy that we have one of the most important kind of property taxes that exists in this country. And it's based on valuations that go back a whole generation or longer. I would have thought if you were really kind of reforming Labour government coming into office and wanting to take unpopular decisions, then the one thing you could have done in your very first budget is to say, listen, every other government since the year dot has been too scared to do this. We're going to do it. We're going to create a more functional system. Administratively, collecting that money would be kind of doable. You'd have to go around and do the work of revaluing. But as you say, they've ruled that out. I guess they're too scared of it, frankly. It would be so unpopular. So I think in the absence of that, probably the most likely thing would be capital gains tax. I think that's just the most straightforward thing. If they're looking for something that's like a wealth tax where they can raise more money and it's administratively possible, you might not make enough money to fill the hole even then, frankly, but it gets you further in the way and it ticks off the wealth tax thing and it doesn't fall foul of your commitments you've already made.
One other option that is open to the Chancellor is maybe just finding a little bit of wiggle room around her very, very, very ironclad fiscal rules.
Non-negotiable. They're non-negotiable.
So she says. So she told the Mansion House. But just before recess, there was a whisper. Now, there is a little bit of wiggle room already built into the fiscal rules that not many people know about. And that is that from spring 2027, she's allowed to be about 13 to 15 billion pounds shy of meeting her target in 2029, which is her main fiscal rule that all day-to-day government spending should be paid for by tax, not borrowing. She's allowed to miss that by 13 to 15 billion pounds and still say that she's met her rule, right? And in the document that was published last October, that exists, that ability to sort of miss your rule by a bit, providing you promise to get back into balance by the next budget, is there from 2027. The whisper that I was picking up was that maybe somehow they bring forward the date that she can pull that lever and miss that target by a little bit. Now, I don't know whether or not they're going to do that. And the Treasury was a little bit opaque. They were playing it down, but not definitively as far as I can see ruling it out when I last checked in with them. But there's a bigger question, which I'd love to know your view on, Ed, which is effectively what that would do would be to solve the problem that she's got, the black hole problem, by borrowing a bit more. And the question I have for you is, if she did that, how much more will the market put up with?
So the way to think about it is, it's like we're in the pitch dark because we don't know, but we are very close to a precipice. We don't know how close the precipice is, but we know there is a precipice. There is a point at which when you say you're just going to borrow a lot more, where the market basically starts to fret about it a lot. What you do know is there is a point at which the market will just get really worried and will interest rates start going through the roof. And I think what was really telling from the last period just before recess was that, that moment in the Commons, that moment when Rachel Reeves was in tears and the market, they were clearly nervous. One presumes that part of it was they thought that she was about to be fired. And then as a result of that, there's going to be a massive change in the fiscal rules and the fiscal environment. And therefore, the UK government was probably going to borrow more. I mean, that's my assumption. It seems relatively conservative. So if that's the case, I just think there's going to be even more caution in the Treasury about kind of doing anything to the fiscal rules. I think they'd probably like to activate that little footnote, definitely, because it makes their life easier. They kind of get about 10 billion or so of leeway. But I think they're going to be even more cautious than they would have otherwise been, just on the basis of what just happened just recently. And so I think they would probably rather go for tax rises than fiddling the fiscal rules. And I say this as I'm not a big fan of fiscal. I know this is not a podcast about fiscal rules.
It is sometimes.
Well, yeah, exactly. I know. It turns out politics is basically about fiscal rules these days. They are kind of fundamentally a little bit frustrating and silly, and you don't actually need them. We didn't have fiscal rules before Gordon Brown.
So the head of the OBR, Richard Reeves, said before recess that the UK is very exposed to shocks, the tax burden close to an all-time high, as we've reflected, the size of the state also getting close to an all-time high as well. And he went as far as saying there are reasons to be concerned about the level of UK government debt and for it to feature in decisions that are being taken. That was quite a sort of elbow in the ribs to the government there. That sounded pretty ominous.
And I think, probably the reason Richard Hughes is talking about this in part is because there was a great chart in this recent fiscal risks report they put out, which basically showed what happened in every single fiscal event going back to George Osborne. The government would say, like, that national debt, it's going up for the next few years. Yes, we will grant you that. But in year 3, 4, 5, it goes down. And then the OBR superimposed against that chart, which looks like a little hump, what actually happened. What actually happened is the national debt went up, 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 and it never stopped going down. And I think, in some ways, there's an indictment there of Rachel Reeves's actual change to the fiscal rules. Her ironclad fiscal rules allow her to raise the national debt by even more than would have been allowed under the previous fiscal rules.
I know what we're talking as if everything's going up and everything's worse, etc. There's just a little international voice in my head is saying, just coming back from Germany, where they're about to go to this massive borrowing splurge, right? That's Germany. So we're not completely off trend.
Yeah, no, that's true. I would say, so Germany, Germany has had this kind of Schwarzer Null, haven't they? They've had this idea that you're going to have balanced budgets for years and years. So in a way, there's this massive shift in German politics where they are starting to borrow for the first time in decades. And that is a massive deal. In a way, the more nerve-wracking comparison is France, because you look at France and look at the French budget, and that is just going higher and higher. And actually, the UK, in comparison with France, we're looking kind of okay. So it's not like we're an outlier on this, but all the same, I think it goes back to 2022. We had a moment, and I talked to people in the markets about this, so not economists, but people who are dealing, gilt-edged traders. They found that a very profound moment because it showed where that UK precipice was. It showed there was a precipice. And the striking thing is when you look at the UK's borrowing costs, just our interest rates versus other countries, that was a step shift. We went to be middle of the pack, higher than everyone else. We were an outlier, and that hasn't gone away. So I think there is this kind of psychosis where the UK is now seen not necessarily as an ugly duckling, but if there is any strain within government borrowing, we are probably the first one to feel it because everyone knows that's the moment where suddenly things go wrong.
Ed, in terms of sorting out the solution to growth and encouraging projects to come to the UK, there were big words in the election campaign about a wall of investment. To what extent do you think there's been any positive signs since Labour came to power?
I think it's too early to say. You talk to business people and they're broadly, they moan about national insurance, understandably. And a lot of people in the kind of wealth world are not happy about non-doms, and actually even more the inheritance tax changes for overseas assets. At the same time, you're seeing it's not like suddenly people are listing their companies in London. In fact, that was already a problem. There were too few listed. The number of IPOs, initial public offerings in London, had dropped down, and it just hasn't come back. People don't seem to be into London, putting their, raising money in London, which is pretty disastrous as well. We've never seen it quite as bad as it is at the moment. So all of that stuff is not positive, but it's kind of slightly oil tankerish. It does take quite a long time to try to encourage investment, and it's not feasible. Remember the growth speech that back when Keir Starmer and Rachel Reeves were just talking about growth, that kind of stuff, trying to get rid of some of regulations, the stuff that you've talked about, Sam.
So there are some Labour MPs who would say that the problem isn't so much growth, it's the way we are measuring it and measuring the government against the target, and specifically the role of the OBR here, the Office for Budget Responsibility. And before the summer, the OBR was pretty bullish about the way it was measuring growth. It wouldn't budge when some in Labour suggested it should be more optimistic about predictions. The result is a kind of Soviet solution to this, Ed, which is you could get rid of the OBR or at least downgrade it or not hear from it so often.
I think it probably falls into the same thing as the fiscal rules. And it is kind of crazy when you think about it that a change in forecast from the Office for Budget Responsibility could cause the government to raise taxes by £10 billion. Just because they're changing their forecast. And they're not even they're changing their forecast, which then impacts where borrowing is in 3 years' time. The fact that then wags the fiscal dog and all of a sudden we're all paying higher taxes, that is a bit dysfunctional when you think about it. So I think it's kind of reasonable to ask the question about whether there should be so many of these events. I think reasonably there could be one event a year or one forecast a year. But the problem again is I just think they will be super nervous about, you can make these changes when you've got a decent fiscal situation, but when you're up against the wall, when you're on the edge of that precipice and in the dark, that's not a good time to be changing these rules or these institutions.
I was wondering how Sam was responding to the tail wagging the dog on the precipice in a black hole.
I'm just trying to add to the analogy central.
Yeah, with a blindfold, because that's what dealing with the global economy has felt a little bit like because of Donald Trump. Look, that is one of the reasons that growth figures are so low, right? We've got a US president, supposedly the head of our closest ally, and he is slapping global tariffs on the UK that are still hurting our industries. For all that Donald Trump's warm words about him liking Keir Starmer, his Trumps continue to hurt us and hope our growth figures. Tariffs are your specialist subject, Ed. What do you think of the sort of way the global debate about global trade has changed and the impact of what Donald Trump has done?
I would just a slight fact check on that. So far, Q2 growth in the UK was pretty damn good. And it was partly good because a lot of people were exporting stuff, trying to front run the tariffs and get stuff into America before the tariffs took effect. But then, yeah, as a result of the tariffs, that it's probably going to be worse than expected in Q3, and who knows what happens afterwards. Worth noting, other countries in Europe are looking towards the UK and going, oh, we quite like a deal like that. Yes, there's massive provisos. Even if all of this deal comes through, and by the way, not all of it has actually been processed. There's still the bit about steel and aluminium, which hasn't yet come into effect. But even so, we're paying higher tariffs than we were before, but we've got a better deal than any other country around the world. And so in the short run, tariffs are pretty kind of GDP negative. It's very kind of unfathomable to try and work out what on earth Donald Trump is going to do next. And so it's not just the tariffs. It's just like, how on earth do you as a business plan in an environment where fundamental things that you come to rely on might just completely change next year? What's the point in building a steel plant if you think that the next president is going to kind of get rid of those tariffs because suddenly the sums don't add up?
But does that mean that you think that was a one-off then? And it's unlikely it was part nationalisation, quite specific circumstance. It was steel, which for a lot of people, that is a kind of strategic backbone of the economy. You could make the case, all right, it's not great in the signal it sends, but let's not get too, scare quotes about it.
I think they're going to do it again, Anne. I think there's another. Yeah, I've got a hunch. There's another nationalisation to come. There's a steel plant in Rotherham, which looks to me like it's not on its last legs, because actually it's a pretty good plant making really good steel that goes into like aircraft landing gear. I think they might end up getting nationalised by the government. I've thought this for a while, and it's probably just a matter of time. And partly that's because it's struggling. Partly it's also because actually you could plug that into the British steel plant at Scunthorpe and actually have a relatively functional set of furnaces. But yeah, the government, it does feel a bit old-fashioned, doesn't it? A Labour government nationalising steelworks. It's not the first time we've heard of those kinds of things.
Okay, that's the policy side. I'm interested in what both of you make of Rachel Reeves, the person. You both know her. You've studied her close up. And we've talked a bit about the last few weeks for Rachel Reeves, but has she turned out to be a surprising Chancellor?
So I'm very interested, having been with Rachel Reeves at spring meetings at the IMF, and Ed will have also had a lot of contact with her this year. We've seen someone who's really projected being very in control, being able to work the long days. It's an incredibly grueling job. And you're always at the end of the sharp end of the risk. It's not, you don't just get the good news. You rarely get the good news, or you have to make it up or persuade people it's good. That was an unusual moment to see her out of control. But I think a lot rides on her being able to come back into this autumn, reassure her party, also reassure the markets, but business in general, the country. I would not write off Rachel Reeves.
But the funny thing is, though, and I mean, I don't know if it's the same for you, but when I talk to a lot of people around Whitehall and the Treasury, maybe less so the Treasury, a lot of people thought that she might not be Chancellor by kind of roundabout now, just based on all of the challenges on the economy and Keir Starmer's proclivity for firing people when he feels he needs to. And in a strange way, it's going to be a long year and it's going to be a long few months, but in a strange way, that episode in the Commons has given her some strength, because it will have freaked a lot of people out to see the way the market has reacted. This is this government which came into office saying they're not going to be like Liz Truss, and that really was the kind of closest single moment to it. Like you, I was surprised and quite distressed to see. I mean, it's a distressing thing to witness, because it seems so out of character in terms of every time I've interviewed her, she's been very keen to project control. And she is, she's much warmer than she seems in interviews, in person, when the camera's not running. She is a warm person, and I think feels the mantle of trying to project this kind of Iron Chancellor persona quite strongly on her shoulders. But yeah, I feel like her position is safer than it was before that. But golly, it's going to be so tough to have to basically admit that you're having to do really nasty, painful, expensive things that is going to affect a lot of your electoral base, purely because you couldn't get your original plan through.
I am a little bit less certain than either of you that Rachel Reeves' longevity can be relied upon for this reason. I agree with Ed. I think come October, November time, when we've got the budget, people's hair's going to be on fire at the scale of the tax rises that she's almost certainly going to have to do. I think that's going to feel like an incredibly unpleasant moment. She promised that there was going to be one big tax rising budget in this parliament. That was last year. Now she's on course to probably have to do it all over again this autumn. But it's more than that. She's created this kind of doom loop. a doom loop that is a product of her fiscal rules that mean that at least once, possibly twice a year, we're going to come back and find she's having to come back for more. So what happened in March was that the OBR were on course to judge that she was going to miss her fiscal rules, break her fiscal rules, and so she had to come back for savings and for bits of the welfare budget in order to top up the numbers. That's going to happen again this November. And then quite possibly next March and next November again, unless there's a growth miracle or some kind of absolutely phenomenal thing. Any kind of problem, any kind of spending is going to have to match by Rachel Reeves trying to find money from elsewhere to fund it. And so long as growth does not improve, and the OBR doesn't expect there to be a big uptick in growth, and nor does it look like there is from any of the forecasters that I can see, maybe twice a year, Rachel Reeves is going to have to come back and presumably ask for more tax rises. And I just think that there is only so much can everybody wear that. On top of that, she is the least popular member of this government, according to the polling. She is bottom of the charts amongst the public. She is bottom of the chart amongst Labour voters, according to YouGov. It's a hell of a place to come back from. Isn't there a point at which Keir Starmer makes her sort of own some of the bad news and then moves on from her? Isn't that actually, if you're being utterly ruthless, a better, more strategic option to go for if you're the Prime Minister?
Can I upsell you on that strategic option from a former Chancellor, I won't name, who just said, no, don't do that. I said, well, most likely to happen in the guild of Chancellors, he was not being political across the party divide, let Rachel Reeves take this pain and then put in another Chancellor. What is the point if you just inserted another Chancellor, a plug-in Chancellor? I don't know. Why would you do it now? This former Chancellor thought give it another year. That would give either Rachel Reeves time to rally, or if it didn't work out and was the doom loop that my learned friend Sam thinks, then someone else would come in. Still have time before the next election.
Ed, the doom loop, do you see it getting any better?
Yeah, I think you were a little bit bleak there, to be honest with you. Because, I mean, yes, it's true. Most of the economic forecasts are pretty rubbish. But I think there is an alternative view. I mean, there's all sorts of things that could improve to the upside. I mean, who knows? It doesn't look like Donald Trump's going to be able to get a deal between Putin and Zelensky. But if something like that were to happen, then, I mean, what happens? Energy prices go down, suddenly the cost of doing stuff goes down, and suddenly, GDP could potentially go up by quite a lot. Suddenly we could be talking about reindustrialization rather than deindustrialization. You've got AI coming along that obviously is going to be very disruptive. I know you know a little bit about AI, Sam. And that could create enormous amounts of economic growth, especially in a services sector economy like the UK. So I think there are reasons for a bit of hope.
Having faith in Ed Conway with Ed Conway. There's a ministry there that we can all follow. Well, on that little note of optimism, it feels like a good moment to say thank you very much indeed to Ed Conway, and we will see you again soon.
Yeah, bye, Ed. Bye. Nice to have you along.
I mean, I hope you might invite me back one day.
Well, it's a very, very high bar.
Thank you very much indeed. Bye-bye.